Thank you so much for what has already been an incredibly generative day celebrating someone who is honestly an undersung heroine here at NYU, someone who has done so much to transform this institution and to set so many young lawyers on their paths. Peggy, it's an absolute delight to celebrate you, and it is even more of a pleasure to do so by having this conversation today with someone who has followed in Peggy's path, who has been mentored and supported by Peggy. So please let me introduce Maya Wiley. Maya likely needs no introduction to many of you, but she is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. She's also a nationally respected civil rights attorney, and she's been a litigator with the ACLU, the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, and she's also served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. She's been a program creator in philanthropy, nonprofit, government, and higher education, and she's helped create a criminal justice program for a major foundation in South Africa. Many of you will know Maya for her work on behalf of New Yorkers when she was the first Black woman to serve as counsel to New York's mayor, then Bill de Blasio. There, she worked to protect and expand access to civil rights, opportunities for minority and women-owned business contractors, and broadband access for all New Yorkers. She also served on and chaired the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. As chair of that board, she led the release of the hold on proceedings against Daniel Pantaleo, whose illegal chokehold killed Eric Garner, and she co-chaired the mayor's school diversity advisory group that authored 2 major reports on integrating New York City public schools. She has received numerous awards for her work and has been a stalwart and indefatigable voice for rights, justice, and democracy. I know her particularly as my compatriot in a Zoom box on MSNBC, so it is especially nice to see her here outside of her box in the flesh. So please join me in welcoming Maya Wiley. Okay, so Maya, we have heard some discussion of the South African Constitution and its protections for affirmative rights and its grounding in an ethic of human rights. In the United States, we aren't necessarily used to thinking about civil rights in the same breath as human rights, but your organization, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, does think about them in concert. So can you tease out for us, and there are a number of law students in the backs receiving extra credit for constitutional law. Can you tease out for those in the back who may not understand the distinction, what is the difference between a civil rights approach and a human rights approach, and why do you view it as integral to keep the two together and imbricated?
Well, thank you for that question, and I am going to answer it, but it's not before appreciations, because I can't be sitting here in the presence of Professor Peggy Cooper Davis without saying, one, how even as a young lawyer, and maybe especially as a young lawyer when I was at the Legal Defense Fund, she loomed so large, and we relied on her for the work that we were doing at LDF, and for the guidance, counsel, and frankly, the path that she laid for how to be a transformative lawyer. Because that ain't the same thing as just being a lawyer, y'all. It's like, no, I'm not just trying to make the law, implement what is. We're trying to make what is different. And that's really the legacy of Professor Cooper Davis's work. And I'm very sad that my sister in arms, Professor Archer, isn't here, because we have been in the trenches together. And I'm always intimidated to be anywhere speaking with Melissa, including in that little box on MSNBC, because I'm like, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. And for all y'all getting extra credit in con law, I got a terrible grade because the shit didn't make any sense to me. But you know why? And I'm sorry, I do curse because I am an angry Black woman. And unabashedly so. But I mean that with sincerity. It doesn't make sense when you're in that con law class. And it doesn't make sense for all the reasons that Peggy has pointed us to. And that's why I'm going to come back full circle to this question about why the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights put it in our title. So just a little bit of background just to square this up. The Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights was founded in 1950, so we're almost three decades old, by the NAACP, so you know what I'm talking about. We got Roy Wilkins, we got A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and we have Arnie Aronson, who's one of the most important Jewish leaders of the time, right? And so that's the founding of the Leadership Conference, but it was being founded because in the fight for the second Reconstruction, because it won the first, it's not the last, and it's actually an unbroken line of struggle against constant resistance to reframing the underpinnings and the structure of our society to be one that lives up to the ideals we say we aspire to as a country. And so in 1950, the idea is, well, we have to start actually pooling our power in coalition for all that work that's happening at local level, at state level, to have federal impact, like the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then on and on and on, and I won't go on, because we'll be here all day. But you know, Wade Henderson, who ran the Leadership Conference for decades, and it was lovely just to see last night, had the foresight to say, we have to add human rights to our title because of both between Congress and between the courts refusing to implement the idea and the intention behind the first Reconstruction, which includes the Civil Rights Amendments to the Constitution, right? The premise of saying, we did it wrong and we're gonna fix it now, has never been fully implemented, and the international instruments were the ones that said, yeah, we wanna focus on the outcomes of what society's producing. We will, so disparate impact, right? Disparate impact as a symptom of the fact that we haven't given true sense, sensibility, and reinforcement to what those civil rights amendments were always intended to produce, requires us to go outside of the country to say the globe has been grappling with this problem and has created a better, not perfect, not uncontested, but a different legal framework, and we can utilize it to hold the U.S. accountable for what it has refused to do under its own Constitution. So it becomes a tool in the toolbox to put pressure on our third Reconstruction.
Wait, so let's talk about the Reconstructions we've had, right? So, as incomplete and imperfect as they were, here's the book, Neglected Stories, The Constitution and Family Values by Peggy Cooper Davis. And in this book, Professor Davis makes the point that the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, are undergirded by a kind of human rights ethic. Maybe incomplete, maybe non-exhaustive, but there is a human rights ethic because they were forged in response to enslavement. And they took on this question, especially the 14th Amendment, took on the question, what is liberty? And liberty, they understood as being the antithesis of enslavement. And so to understand what the liberty guarantee in the 14th Amendment meant, you have to actually think about what it meant to be enslaved. So it meant not having control over your body in terms of labor, not having control over your body in terms of sexual exploitation, not having control over your body in terms of forced reproduction, not having control over your family because your children could be sold away from you and you could be separated from your partner, not being able to engage in civil marriage like other people. And so in that understanding of what enslavement meant, we had this unarticulated understanding of what is liberty. And so I guess the question, Maya, since Peggy has told us what liberty means, why can't this court see in the 14th Amendment the rights of bodily autonomy that are very clearly expressed by the Reconstruction framers.
How much time do we have? Such an important question, and I think we have to start with the fact that we have never stopped having active, formal, and financed resistance to that first Reconstruction. That some of that resistance has been violence. I am reminded, I was looking up, and I think this is in one of Peggy's articles, and I haven't read the book, so it may be in the book, but, and certainly others have made this point, but if you have a former Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Ed White, who was a former Klansman, who's sitting beside Woodrow Wilson watching the first screening of The Birth of a Nation, and then you ask, why haven't we properly implemented the 14th Amendment? Well, I mean, literal white supremacy. Literal, explicit, ideological. They said, no, we're just not going to do it, even if we had a political system that produced an amendment, 3 amendments, critical amendments. Oh, by the way, that should be read together and never are, right? 13th, 14th, and 15th were a package with a purpose. They weren't individual separable. They had a collective purpose and goal of citizenship. And by citizenship, I'm not talking passport, right? This goes back to the notion of liberty, of autonomy that includes everything from bodily autonomy, family formation, voting, political voice and power, to be able to identify who should lead you, but also how to identify problems that get political entities to act on your behalf, is so central to the foundation of democracy, but it has constantly and unbrokenly been resisted. And the reality is, if we look at the current Supreme Court, it's rigged. It's rigged.
Is it rigged because you can rent a justice, or because of something else?
Well, it's both.
Mm-hmm.
It's. But this is my point of. So resistance. And by the way, I'd resist this way all day long if I had the resources, right? Which is to say, all right, Leonard Leo got a corporation handed to him, $1.6 billion that Federalist Society, right, organizing. Who do we want on the bench to advance our ideology? Who do we want? By the way, civil rights community, we do this too. That's why I say, I ain't mad at you. I'm mad at you have more money than me. But what I mean by that is there's nothing wrong with saying we have an ideology, we like this ideology, we want to see this ideology. But it's not that honest. Because what we do in the leadership conference, we do this all the time, right? We are pushing for pro-civil rights judges to be nominated. We don't say who to nominate, but when we identify who to support in the nomination process, and we do this, we have a whole fair courts team, it is based on whether or not they hold the fundamental ideals of an equal society and whether they have a demonstrated track record to advancing it, right? That's simple. And we're explicit about it, we're upfront about it, we analyze it, and we say publicly what it means. Now, in this case, what we've seen is money that says, although I will say, Donald Trump did tell us, I'm going to appoint Supreme Court justices that are going to reverse Roe. He was explicit, so I give him credit. I give him credit for being a bastard in public. Sorry, that was mean. But I mean it. And that's important, right? In a political system, elections have consequences. But before he was elected, the Senate majority at the time changed the rules on a sitting president that said, oh, the Constitution may say that because elections have consequences and you get to nominate for advice and consent of Congress a candidate to sit on the Supreme Court and you have a vacancy and it's a year to go before you're at the end of your second term. We don't think that's going to happen because it's too close to an election. Where was that rule? Where did that rule come from? It's made up, and it's about power with the understanding that we're not going to allow an election to have its consequences.
So, let's talk about that moment. So that is a major inflection point, the refusal to give Merrick Garland a hearing.
Just a hearing.
Where was the progressive community lobbying about the courts? I mean, like, this actually is my bugaboo. Like, the conservatives have understood how important the courts are. They have understood that their agenda is not one that is amenable to majoritarian politics because the majority of us do not share their vision. And so instead, they prosecute their agenda through the courts, the ultimate counter-majoritarian institution in our society. And so they've worked and they've captured the courts. In that moment, the Merrick Garland situation was the absolute embodiment of what they were doing. And yet we had no one talking about the courts. Hillary Clinton was the Democratic nominee. She picked Tim Kaine to be her vice president. She said nothing about what she would do with regard to an appointment to the Supreme Court if she were picked. And I honestly believe if she had said something like, I'm not putting Merrick Garland on the court, I'm putting the first black woman on the court or the first Asian American on the court, then there would be a third person on that imperfect ticket that could have driven voter turnout, and we would be in a different place.
So, one of there are two things going on here. There are more than two, but there are two things going on here we should name. I mean, one is, and it is true, politicians look at the voters and what motivates them. And on the ideological right, I'm not saying party because it's not true of all Republicans, right? We shouldn't put all people in one bucket just because of their party affiliation. Because there are plenty of Republicans, for example, who support abortion rights. There are. But ideologically, extremists were highly motivated by judicial nominations. That was significantly less true on the left. I'd say that has been changing because of what we have seen, but then so you'll have politicians who will say, this isn't an issue that motivates our voters. The other thing, though, that is happening is money. I mean, this is why I was going back to how well-financed an ideological minority is compared to positions that are held by a diverse and much larger number of people. And I say that because it's one of the things we've been seeing over and over and over again since 2015. It's why I'm putting that $1.6 billion held by Leonard Leo. And if you go and look at, Kim Crenshaw's work and, the African American Policy Forum has tracked the money and has a nice tool, who's financing the banning of books? Half of the protagonists in books that are being banned are people of color, and rough 42%, and about the other half of that 80% that are being banned are LGBTQ. Okay, that's just ideological. That's like, we don't want these stories told. We don't want this history understood, and we don't want to protect the freedom of identity of these people, or the stories or the experiences. The same is happening with voting rights, same money. Now, if you fast forward, and because of the Supreme Court's opinion on affirmative action, which A, was limited to higher education, B, did not completely eliminate it, undermined it radically, didn't eliminate it, but it has now been weaponized as an opinion intentionally and knowingly to now say you can't, as a private venture capital company run by black women, give venture capital only to black women, even though it's 1% of all venture capital dollars. You in Seattle that want to end health disparities, documented health disparities that requires that you look and examine what is going on with this group of people that is producing this disparity, we're now going to say you're discriminating because you're doing that. It has become, but it all goes back to a centralization of ideology, power. And I want to bring it back to one other thing, which we're probably going to get to, because I can't stand that we don't make this connection enough. The opposition to abortion. When did it start? Because it wasn't with Roe.
It's in the 1980s.
You know
Political
how it
realism.
started? When the Southern Baptists started getting sued by the Department of Justice for violating Title VI with their segregationist schools, they started going, because the Southern Baptist Convention had supported abortion.
I'm looking meaningfully at my law students and thinking of Allen versus Wright because the exam is going to be cumulative. Okay, all right, great. So back to this question of what might motivate voters. I imagine a lot of you in the audience are of voting age, so I'm speaking directly to you. Would it motivate you, audience, to think about the election in these terms? If a Republican wins the presidential election, it is highly likely that Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, who are both septuagenarians, will step down, maybe even also the Chief Justice. And they will be replaced by a Republican president who will replace them with teenagers or fetuses. Extending this conservative supermajority for a generation and a half, another generation and a half. Would that motivate you to get to the polls? Yes. Why aren't we talking about this on the left right now?
Well, I mean, I'm talking about all the dang time. But maybe nobody. I think we actually, so one of the things that happens, and this is I say this as a good thing, right? So I'm not saying it as a complaint. We're fighting to restructure society in the image in which we were promised the society would be created. Not that it is, but that our principles say it is. Which means we're fighting on everything. We're fighting about schools, we're fighting about healthcare, we're fighting about voting. We're also fighting about what the US government is doing and what it's doing abroad, and whether it's living our values abroad as well as at home. That's a good thing because they all do, I mean, all these things matter. I'm not gonna say they don't matter, right?
All issues matter.
All issues matter because ain't nobody live a single issue life. I haven't met the person yet who lives a single issue life. The other side has a much easier job because what they are doing and have always done is say, we're just here to preserve the status quo. We're just here to prevent change. Now, we'll do it by understanding the levers of power and working very hard and financing the ability to control the levers of power. That's the point about rigging the rules. So now suddenly the democratic principles around how you get judicial nominations and how they get votes and who gets them when gets rigged. That's why we're now claiming we have voter fraud, and therefore we have to have strict voter ID laws, or you can't give people water who stand in 3-hour lines that they shouldn't even be standing in the first place because you refuse to have early voting, and you close polling sites in places where people of color vote for the wrong party. I mean, that is actually what we're seeing, right? But it's just an example of understanding where and how to pull and control the levers of power in order to be a minority that rules over a diverse majority. But I think because we're constantly, I mean, we got a minimum of 12 issues at the leadership conference, in addition to trying to ensure that we're getting qualified representative judges on the federal bench who understand the lived experience so that when cases come before them, they make the informed decisions that Peggy has so rightly pointed us to understanding the choices that we have, because the answers are prescribed in principle, not in word in the Constitution. All the other side needs to do is just say, no, you can't. It's much harder for us. And we have people who are motivated in different ways for all these different issues. And I think one of the things we have the opportunity to do better is knit these stories together. That's why I hate separating the story of school segregation from abortion. I hate separating the idea of who gets citizenship rights in this country from the idea of whether or not black slaves were citizens. You know, you can't understand the Chinese laundry cases separate from black liberation, right? And you can't understand why we have to fight about corporate personhood without understanding Professor Charles Black, who said the Supreme Court and courts use the 14th Amendment to protect more corporate rights than black rights up into the New Deal. So I'm only saying all that to say we have to do a better job, and it's part of why I took a job leading a coalition that is almost every faith, that is definitely every race, that covers almost every issue we care about from the perspective of democracy, because unless we see ourselves together in all of these things, we lose. And what the forces opposed to true democracy utilize is the ability to try to divide us because we're black or we're white, or we're an immigrant or we're not an immigrant, or because we work or we're a white man in a manufacturing job or not, right? And the truth of the matter has always been that the wages of whiteness have been weaponized against the truth and the determination of a democracy. And that is a lot easier than those of us who say, if you take our abortion rights, you're gonna come for our family rights, you're gonna hurt black people and Latinas and Native women more, you're good, yeah, I mean, right? It's like all these things are true, and this war on woke, this attack on the very notion that we can look at our identity and who we are and figure out how we all benefit, has become a legal argument and has become a sanctioned legal argument. And if we don't understand our power in collective action, they'll keep winning. We have won in the past because of that collective power, and we still have it.
The idea that stories get told and marshaled for particular purposes is not just on the left. And I just want, like, here's a story. I mean, to your point about seeing these struggles as originating from a common fate, what is happening at the border right now and Texas's outright defiance of the federal government is exactly what happened in 1954 in the wake of Brown, when Texas and all of the other southern states refused to implement Brown. I mean, we're seeing the same thing. We aren't seeing it talked about in the same rhetoric, with the same discursive language. Like, this is tantamount to secession. It was understood in 1954 as a bid toward a second civil war, and we should talk about that, what is happening at the border in that way. Separately, I think even as we have failed to link our stories together, the other side is learning to tell better stories, right? So if Peggy wrote about neglected stories back in the 1990s, John Roberts seems to be taking a page out of the Peggy Cooper Davis book and seems to be telling his own set of neglected stories. And these are stories about the people who have been left behind by the Warren Court and the Civil Rights Revolution and DEI and wokeism. So in the last panel, I mentioned in a question that in the oral argument in Biden versus Nebraska, the student loan forgiveness case that was heard last term, the Chief Justice asked a hypothetical of Elizabeth Prelogar, the United States Solicitor General, about whether it was fundamentally fair to an individual who had not attended college but instead had started a lawn care business to have student loan relief. And the background of this is that student loan relief has been very much understood in terms of black and brown borrowers who are more likely to benefit from forgiveness than any other group. That it could be a conduit toward the greater consolidation of intergenerational wealth. And his point was like, yes, fine, but what about the working class white people who don't get that kind of government largesse, who may get other kinds of government largesse, but not that? So that's a different kind of neglected story. And Justice Thomas is also telling neglected stories, right? About the black communities that are deracinated by the deployment of reproductive rights in his imagining, where abortion is the same as eugenics and genocide, right? He's telling a similar kind of story. How do we combat these new neglected stories that are no longer being neglected, but are actively being husbanded to reframe those who historically have been in the majority as new minorities?
You don't ask easy questions, Melissa.
They know in the back. They know.
I actually know it too because she also sits in the host chair. I think about this so much because, one is some of these stories, when your mama used to say, don't tell no stories, don't walk up in this house telling no stories. What she meant was don't walk up here and lie. Some of these stories are not true, right? They're not true. Neglect of white working class comes from refusing to protect civil rights. Every advancement we have had, whether it's shrinking poverty rates, whether it's getting short white men jobs on the police department, because we used to, no, I ain't lying. There used to be a height requirement, and it was a gendered, discriminatory requirement that had nothing to do with doing the job. And when women said, that discriminates against us, and there's no job reason to have that height requirement, and it got rid of a whole bunch of short white men got jobs as police officers. Just saying. So, part of it is there has been a huge amount of neglect. I say this because I think one of the things we have to and must do as a civil rights community, and I mean that writ large, is we have to tell our collective stories of benefit. Because it's a wedge. It's a wedge to say if we help you be trans, then women don't get to be women. That's a lie, right? It's not true. So, I think it's like, how do we, and this is part of why we fight for diverse voices, because we're also maligning diversity, despite all the evidence that shows you get better outcomes, whether you're in a corporate boardroom or whether you're in a hospital, if you have the diversity of experience that can understand something that's happening in a different kind of way, that you get a better outcome, whether it's a business bottom line or whether it's a health outcome, right? Those are true stories, and they're fact-based, as opposed to stories that want to say, and I'm thinking about the Herbert Wexler debate right after Brown, where he says, Brown v. Board is not a neutral principle because you're denying white people the ability to say, we just don't want to associate with you black people. And to do that is not neutral. That's the underpinning of exactly what you're talking about from the Roberts Courts. All that is a lie. Because the principle, as others are putting out, is that we can't have a society. You can have a viewpoint that says you don't like black people. That's not the same thing as you can prevent black people from getting all the equal stuff, like being able to sit in a school of their choice or get right. And so the flip post-Brown becomes white people are losing because of a principle of equality. And we have to recognize that we have to tell the story of equality that says, look how much we did for all these folks, and name them. Name them.
So
name them.
I will note that Herbert Wexler taught at Columbia. And Derek Bell, who talked about interest convergence, taught here. Okay.
Wait, we got Kendall Thomas now.
Well, I mean, redeeming Herbert Wexler from way back.
Yeah.
Yes, Kendall Thomas in the house. Speaking of legal education, it is important to note that Peggy Cooper Davis did not simply write amazing legal scholarship. She was truly the Jennifer Lopez of legal education, a true triple threat, teaching, writing, service. She was also a major leader and innovator in legal pedagogy. And so, Maya, you run an organization that employs hundreds of young lawyers, and you work with young lawyers every day. What do we in the law school need to be doing as a matter of pedagogy to not just train lawyers, but train transformational lawyers equipped with and ready to take on the challenges of bringing into being a true multiracial, multi-faith, pluralistic democracy?
Well, I wish I had the money for hundreds of lawyers, but thank you.
I said you worked with them.
Okay, worked with them. Okay. Yes, we do, because we have all the major litigating groups. But let me just say this. Listen to Peggy. Listen to Melissa. Listen to Deborah. Listen to all the, NYU and so many of our other law schools have so many tremendous academic resources in the form of incredible thinker-doers. And I benefited from that. But I would also say, remember that we have to think about our role as transformational. Meaning our job is not to say, what is my best, and Peggy, all of Peggy's work embodies this. What am I trying to get, not just the corpus society to understand, not what's my best argument to simply get a transaction, right? And I say that because, if you think about, there's so many examples of this, and I was trying to think about the best one for this particular moment in time, and it's hard. But if you think about the ways in which transformational legal work has happened, it's because it has been deeply connected, embedded to movement work. When it's divorced from movement work, it can become much more transactional despite its intent. I don't mean that as despite its intent, because the storytelling that gets into the courtroom is so often formulated by the activism that supports the transformational case getting there. So you can't understand Brown v. Board separate and apart from the fact there were a lot of people doing organizing. You can't even understand the advancement of the 14th Amendment and the Civil War amendments without understanding that there was movement organizing happening to get those amendments created and adopted. None of that happened just because there were lawyers thinking legally. It happened because there were real people making demands on what they thought society needed to be. And if you want to think about the foster care system, which Peggy has done so much work on, in rethinking what does it mean rather than have a system that tears families apart, what's understanding the experience that has created the problem so that the system is fixing the problem rather than reifying it, right? That's a very different way of thinking about lawyering, but you can't lawyer that way disconnected from community experience. You can't. And so but I say this with the great privilege of working with so many lawyers who are deeply connected, and the importance of having those stories that are being told outside of the courtroom showing up in. And I'll give you the most recent example that I was so moved by and gives me so much hope is when we were organizing a rally and showing up on the steps of the Supreme Court when the affirmative action cases were being argued, right? You know how many students were there who were Asian? Most of them. With signs saying, "We support affirmative action, saves affirmative action," undermining the narrative where there was of Ed Blum, who started his career trying to undermine voting rights, and to say, "You don't speak for us." And they were from Harvard. They were from Harvard. And having the Asian American leaders in the civil rights community standing up and saying, "Stop pitting us against each other." That's powerful storytelling in the form of the actual experience of people being impacted. And it matters.
So the Ed Blum example is a really good one, and it has lots of resonance. This idea that we start with voting rights, we make it hard for the people to register majoritarian preferences, either because the districts are gerrymandered or because we are actively suppressing the vote. And then once we've completely distorted the electoral landscape, we start telling stories in which minority preferences are in fact the wishes of the majority. I think we can think of lots of examples in which a very entitled minority has sought to speak for the majority, and people have listened. How do we, as part of this silent majority who may not always have the best opportunity to express our preferences, in majoritarian politics, how can each of us work to ensure that the voices of the majority are not drowned out by the voices of those entitled minorities?
You know, I'm going back to the basics, because it is showing up in every way that makes sense to you matters. So, I mean, I went to the Women's March after, the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, and wore my little pink pussy hat, brought my little daughter, and she wore her pink pussy hat. I mean, just showing up mattered. Like, that mattered. That showed real power of, like, no, this is not. I say that with those students who showed up. And there are multiple ways to show up. I mean, I'm obviously giving the direct action ways to show up, and it matters. The ballot initiatives we've been seeing have mattered tremendously to say, because what it shows is direct democracy, even with the attempts to rule rig, Ohio, has won out because of who the majority is, right, despite the other forms of rule rigging. But it is why I go back to showing up for coalition. I mean, so showing up for each other. I mean, that's my point about the affirmative action cases. It wasn't just black leaders saying, we have to show up for affirmative action by ourselves. It was like a whole bunch of communities saying, no, we're all in this. That matters, whether it's abortion, it matters whether it's LGBTQ, it matters whether it's immigration, and voting centrally, which we so often talk about as an issue for people of color. What we have lost in even that is remembering all of the things we do to make it more difficult to vote makes every person with a disability have a harder time voting, makes every person who is elderly have a harder time voting, makes every person who's a student have a harder time voting. That just doesn't have one race, and it's part of the effort to undermine the political power of the willing to do democracy. Mm-hmm. And so any of those ways, showing up and handing bottles of water out in a line at a voting polling station matters, right? Every single act that is a democratic act, because I consider those democratic acts, whether it's handing that bottle of water out or monitoring a poll site or showing up at a protest or making it clear in what kinds of issues and supporting issues, all of that matters. And the only thing I will say is it is so powerful when we do it outside of our own identities and show that it isn't us. Because I do think that what is so reinforcing and hopeful about, despite the rule riggings, despite the money in politics, despite the power that exists on the ideological and extreme right, there are more of us. There are many more of us. And that matters.
Let's hear from some more of us. Time for audience questions. Okay, Taylor Rose? Tyler Rose, sorry, excuse me. Can we pass the microphone around too? Just 1 second for the microphone.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. Hi, I'm Tyler Rose Clemens. I'm the Associate Director of Lawyering this year. Such an honor to witness this. It feels a bit like a religious experience, which is nice in these days. So I want to stir the pot maybe a little bit and talk about Democrats. My first job out of law school was at Lawyers Committee under Kristen Clark, and it was the year that the Merrick Garland thing happened. And a huge part of what I was doing at Lawyers Committee was working on that. I was on calls multiple times per week with the Fair Courts people under Vanita when she was still the CEO. When we say that progressives were not talking about it or doing anything, I mean, progressive people were, right? Democrats were not. And so, I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, Hillary Clinton is not a progressive, she's a neoliberal. And this tension that we have, I think, always had within the movement, where the political party that we see as the vehicle for our political objectives is, like, actually really out of step with us in a lot of ways. And at least in this moment, maybe it's changing, it's still very wedded to the idea that our institutions work in a certain way, that the Republicans are not in a post-Tea Party era. And how do you navigate that now in this time when we're moving into a general election where a lot of people are frustrated with the choice that we have?
So, one, thank you, because the really important points in question, and I actually hear in that an important comment. I want to go back to what I was saying, just as a matter of fact. I didn't say progressive, I said voters. Voters.
I did. It was my fault. It's me.
No, well, but actually this is important because progressives have to remember we're not a majority. We're not. I say that's a progressive. I don't say that with joy, but we're not. So when you talk about what's happening inside the Beltway, they're not listening to, it's not about whether they're listening to progressives or not listening to progressives. It's like they're listening to voters. Not all voters, even who agree with us on a lot of our issues, consider themselves progressive. So when you say progressives, like the Lawyers Committee and our Fair Courts team at the leadership, sure, but that was not what folks out, and I'm telling you, as someone who's run for public office, progressives said a lot of stuff to me that I wasn't hearing in Black and brown communities, right? And so part of what we have to recognize, and I'm gonna just tell you, we need to listen to people who are impacted. And sometimes progressives, we get so invested in our idea that we forget that people are saying, y'all talking about some stuff and I can't pay the rent. My kid is getting a police officer in their school. Talk to me about that. So when you say that, you are right about those of us who are already engaged in the fight on judges like Merrick Garland. What we forget is when people, that's one point about people don't live single issue lives. I'm not saying they disagree with us about whether we want judges who do the right thing, but what room do people who are facing eviction have to say, yes, I'm gonna make my priority whether Merrick Garland gets a hearing? No, that's a position of privilege. That's a position of privilege. So part of it is, I mean, we do need, movement times. The reason the civil rights movement, whether it was the first Reconstruction or the second, was so successful was because folks were motivated because they saw themselves in it and they showed up. And they led, and they did it whether it was 4 college students in Greensboro. They weren't part of it. They just showed up at the Woolworth counter and sat down. That's what happened, right? But that story, everybody was feeling it and it popped up all over the place, decentralized. So no, we still have to fight about the judges, right? But I'm just saying for the ideological right, they had the resources and the ability to use the power levers to do something we didn't. Your point about the Democrat, and just going back to the Democratic Party, I will agree with in the sense that they say, those aren't the rules, we'll play by the rules. No, don't talk to us about the blue slip or whether or not we should expand the number of justices. I mean, the Leadership Conference's position has been ethics, and we say you have to look at all the reforms. But I think this debate about what does it mean to reform systems so that they actually are representative and work, and part of the complaint that I think you're also raising is Democrats keep playing by these rules, the other side keeps changing. And why are we not using the power we have? And I would say that goes back to my point about participation. Unless people are participating in the demand for the change, because we do need that. And that's why we do need to have the ability to be more connected to communities.
But what Tyler Rose is saying is also a failure to tell good stories. Because when the Republicans stonewalled on Merrick Garland, the story that was told was that if this goes through, then there will be a liberal supermajority on this court because Merrick Garland will take Antonin Scalia's seat. And so their voters were energized to prevent the liberal supermajority that they feared, a 6-3 liberal court. And we did not tell a story about if you let this happen and Merrick Garland isn't seated, and part of this too is I think everyone expected Hillary Clinton to win.
I think that's actually the bigger thing was people thought it'll be fine.
Everyone, wrong. Let's not do that again. But we did not tell a good story about like what is at risk with this continued 5-4 conservative majority, where we're replacing one very ideologically extreme justice with someone who's even more extreme.
So, I mean, I think the thing is, it's not that we weren't telling that story. I mean, meaning advocates were, but there's also who has the megaphone and how does it get utilized. I mean, and you and I, we know this, right? We can sit up there at MSNBC and talk about the 14th Amendment says that Trump shouldn't be on the ballot. I can say that. We can say that on, I don't know if you've said it on MSNBC.
I've said it more nuanced.
A little bit. I'm not often as nuanced as Melissa.
You don't work at NYU Law.
I did.
Answer to a dean.
Fair. But I mean, and obviously I haven't even said it that sharply either. But the point is, like, even saying like that, now there's a megaphone on that because it's a politically sexy story. This is where, again, I go back to, because there has been a lot of, when I say media capture, I'm not talking about all of news media, but we do have something that was not true in 1964, which is we actually have people getting news and information that is completely separate and opposed to others, right? We're not all getting the same information anymore, and I think we have to understand that as a matter of organizing too, because part of my frustration is we say lots of things that we never see anywhere else. It's not that we're not saying it. It's not penetrating. And I think that goes back to the point about, well, who are we talking to and how are we talking about it? Because we at the Leadership Conference have been doing messaging to talk to people about how their lives would be different with certain kinds of judges on the bench. In other words, not about the nominee individually, but about, like, how does these courts and these decisions show up in your daily life? Which is a different kind of conversation, but you're not going to see it in the news media. And finding the vehicles for the kind of storytelling that Peggy is talking about that actually understands we have a very, very, very different way of looking at sharing stories and reaching people, and it has changed, and we can't just do the old way of thinking what's on ABC or MSNBC, but what's getting out in these other channels of ways to reach people that is outside of the organized formal news media.
I see Jeremy Vanook with a question, and then Kendall Thomas. Jeremy Vanook is in the back. Student question. No extra credit for this question. And then Kendall Thomas.
Oh, then I'll give it back. This is kind of building on the discussion that we've been having right now, which is it often feels like there's a sense of, well, how could it get any worse? That seems to kind of stymie this conversation. I know I personally have had conversations, including about court stuff, on policy issues generally, where the response that you get is some combination of, well, but they've already gotten rid of Roe v. Wade. How could it get worse? But also a disbelief in, well, but they wouldn't seriously do that. And I guess my question is, from both the constitutional law perspective and from the advocacy activism side of things, what you guys see as a path forward for combating that sentiment towards convincing people of what kind of the future problems might be and how we can avert them.
They can definitely do more. That's all I'm going to say. Okay.
Well, can I one? And I know I'm rarely brief when I'm not on TV, and there's a producer saying, "Shut up, Maya." I mean, this is an important question because I think what we have to remember is there's the legal arguments that you make in court about what the legal paths are. I mean, I think from a legal standpoint, the points are quite easy. Clarence Thomas laid the roadmap out for coming for everything explicitly. Yeah. Explicitly. Now, I'm not making stuff up now. You just read his opinion, right? It wasn't hidden where the next steps are. But I think I would flip it on its head and say the conversation we have to be having out in the public has to be, what kind of society do we want to live in? What's your vision? What do you want your life to look like? Because I don't know anyone right now who would answer that question as, oh, no, it's good, it's fine, I'm good right now. Right? And when you ask people, and I'm telling you, as someone who had to drive around Louisiana and had to talk to a Southern Baptist white school principal on an education case, but all the things he was saying about what he wanted for his school was the same thing I would hear in Harlem or in East New York. They weren't different. And I think when we start to say, and then when we start to talk about power to make it happen, because one of the things I'll say, all right, how many people in this room are between the ages of 18 and 35?
It's a hostile question.
And I don't know. Hey, look, y'all, I just turned 60, so I feel you. But my point about asking that question is, the reality of the rule rigging is because y'all the future. You, a third of the electorate, very soon. And you know what your percentage of voting is? Demographically, I'm not talking about you personally. Demographically, you know what your percentage is? 20-something%. But you know, if I ask any of these issues about what do you think about trans rights? What do you think about free college? What do you think about comprehensive immigration reform? What do you think about, right? I can ask what do you think about abortion? What I'm going to hear is we need something radically different from what's getting spewed out by this court or by some of the folks in power. And yet, we celebrate, and if you look in the midterms, look at the ballot initiatives, we got the outcomes that said you will not put a constitutional amendment in a state constitution that says we can't have abortion, or you will put a constitutional amendment in that says we will protect abortion, because you got up to 31%. If you would show up at 40%, you'd be running the damn country. And all that vision would be happening. And the reason I say it that way is because people don't feel that statement comes from, I don't think it matters what I do, rather than it would make a tremendous difference if I did.
Thank you so much for a rich conversation, and thank you so much, Peggy, for bringing us all together. I want to circle back, actually, to the place where you started, which has to do with the relationship between civil rights, human rights, and telling transformational stories as part of the work of transformation. Because one story we could tell about the relationship between civil rights and human rights is that civil rights, at least as we've understood the term in this country, is about political change. Human rights, at least globally, has encompassed a conversation about economic and social rights, which has not penetrated the American imagination. And it makes me think that one of the issues that we need to grapple with, particularly in thinking about a path forward, as our panelists will be doing in the next panel, is to consider the ways in which it has not just been white supremacy that underdeveloped Black and brown America, to riff on the title of a book by my late colleague Manning Marable. Manning's book was How Capitalism Has Underdeveloped Black America, right? And I think even in some progressive circles, we have some anxiety about a conversation that's talking about transforming capitalism. But in a country where capitalism has always been racial capitalism, it's worth asking, can we seek and secure the transformation we want, changing our political system without changing at the root the economic system, which is as much an engine of the inequality that puts people in a position of not being able to think about who to support at the Supreme Court because they can't pay their rent or because they're living with food insecurity as anything else. So in talking to the young people here, what would you say about the importance of an analysis and developing a program of action that addresses not just change in the law, but fundamental transformation of our political economy and the way things get distributed at a moment in our history in which we're living with, it may not be unprecedented inequality, but it's a level of inequality that we have not seen in over a century.
So, such an important question, and I go back to the fact that, I can't separate the two, meaning, one of the reasons the human rights regime is so strong is because it's, to your point, Kendall, it's political and social and economic. It's all of them. But the reality is, even in countries that endorse and have signed on to those treaties, like CERD, like all of the economic and social rights initiatives, is a political will. And so, and I just find it so much more effective to talk about what we want to be than to label. And I mean that because I think in terms of where do we find our alliances for the kinds of things we agree on, because we agree on so many things. The reason I ran for office was because you're right, you can't just do it through the law, right? You have to have the ability and strength and power to create programs that deliver differently. And, but you can't separate them. All of these, so the point about activism and direct action, organizing the demands, having coalition, doing that in a way that's everything from, you can't do it if you don't have the right to decide who's leading, because the difference between a candidate that'll say, let's subsidize rent so we don't have an eviction crisis, versus let's figure out how to give enough incentives to real estate developers to ensure that they're putting us into 85% of AMI. That is a decision about what we mean by how we structure our economics and our social benefits. The difference is it's a conversation about outcome and the program that delivers the outcome. So I only say that to say, if we're talking about how we get to an endpoint, we need the law, we need leaders, and therefore politics and political participation in all its forms, and we need to be doing it in a way that talks about what we're trying to create for people's lives, which I think is just the practical way in non-ideological terms of saying, can people decide whether they have a child or not? Can people support their family or not? Do schools work or not? Are we safe, including from institutions of government? Right? My point is, I have never seen a way to separate the issue of a different social and economic regime from political power.
Right. So this has been an amazing conversation. I think we are all motivated and inspired to start telling transformational stories that have long been neglected, whether it is about inequality or capitalism or wresting back political power. But thank you, Maya, for helping us to navigate all of this. And thank you to Peggy for inspiring such a generative conversation. We'll take a 15-minute break before the next panel will resume at 1:45. Thank you.